Snowbound 3 weeks without food in her cabin, a Lakota chief broke through with meat and hope. The elk was a bull, 4 years old by the thickness of his neck, and he had come down out of the timber the way elk come down when the high country has turned against them, reluctant, sideways, stopping every few yards to test the air. He did not smell me. I had been still for 2 hours in the spruce line to the east of the draw, still enough that the cold had moved from something I felt to something I simply was, and I had not moved a finger when the light changed and he stepped into the open. I shot him clean through the shoulders at 40 yards. He went down in the snow and did not get up. That is where this story begins, not with the woman. With the elk and with what I did next and why. I am going to tell you about a winter, about what a man does when he finds out something has been happening nearby and he did not know, and what that not knowing costs, and what you do with the cost. I am going to tell you it plain, the way it happened, and I am going to start with the elk because the elk is the reason any of it is possible at all, and because a man should give credit where credit belongs, even to an animal. The elk is dead, the woman is alive, those two facts are connected, and this is how. My name in the language of my people means standing rock, not the place, the thing itself, the particular quality of a stone that does not move regardless of what the water does around it. My mother gave me that name when I was 4 days old, which means she had been watching me for 4 days and had already seen something in me that required a name like that. I have tried to live up to it. I have not always known if I succeeded. I was 58 years old that winter. I had been chief of my people for 19 years, which means I had spent 19 years being the rock the water moved around. I do not say that as complaint. It is simply what the work is. You become the fixed point. People look to you when they do not know which way to move, and you give them a direction and they move and the crisis passes, and then there is another crisis and they look to you again. This is the work of a chief. It requires a certain kind of self-erasure, not of the self exactly, but of the self's needs. What you need does not enter the calculation. What the people need enters the calculation. That is the whole of it. I had been doing this for 19 years. I was good at it. I was not sure I was much good at anything else anymore. My wife had been gone for 11 years. Not dead, she had died of the fever when my children were small, and that grief had its own shape and I had lived inside it and come out the other side of it, which is all you can say about grief of that kind. My children were grown. My son had taken a wife and moved to the north end of the land. My daughter had married a man from another band, and I saw her twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and I was glad of it each time and understood when she left that this was right and proper, and that the gladness of it did not require her to stay. I lived alone in the main house. I had the council, the elders, the young men who needed counsel and did not always want to hear it. I had the land and the work of the land and the endless negotiation with the agent and the endless smaller negotiations with the neighboring ranchers who pushed their cattle across our lines in dry summers and then retreated behind formal politeness in the spring. I had enough to fill every day. What I did not have, and I am telling you this not because I knew it at the time, but because I know it now, looking back, was anyone who needed me in particular. Not the people as a whole, one person, the particular neediness of one person who looks at you and not at the chief behind you. I had not understood that I was missing that. I had arranged my life so thoroughly around the absence of it that the absence had become invisible, like the air in a room that you do not notice until it is gone. I did not know any of this that November. I was simply a chief, living his chief's life, preparing for a winter that the early cold promised would be hard. The snow came in the 2nd week of November, and it did not let up. Not a blizzard, something more patient than a blizzard. A steady, methodical snowfall that went on for days and then paused and then went on again, packing the draws and closing the lower trails and building up in the pines until the branches bent and the world went white and quiet, and the distances shrank. By the end of the 3rd week of November, the lower road was gone under 4 feet of pack, and the trails to the eastern homesteads were closed in a serious way, not passable without equipment, or without the particular knowledge of the land that tells you where the ground is and where it isn't. I knew those trails. I had ridden them for 30 years. I knew which draws drifted and which ones stayed open under the timber. I knew where the elk moved when the high country pushed them down, and where the deer yarded in deep snow, and where the water ran under the ice if you knew to look for the particular darkness in the surface. This land was mine in the way that land becomes yours when you have moved over it for decades, not ownership exactly, more like fluency. I could read it the way some men read words on a page. In the first week of December, I went out after the elk. Not because I needed to, we had enough laid in for the winter. But the elk had been moving in the draw below the eastern timber for 3 days. I had seen their tracks, and a bull that size in that location is not an opportunity a man wastes if he can help it. The meat would go to the families that had not put up enough. There are always some. I shot the bull at first light, and I stood over him in the snow, and I said what needs to be said, and then I began the work of opening him up. It was while I was working on the elk that I heard it. A sound distant from the direction of the eastern homesteads. The sound a person makes when they have been trying not to make any sound for a long time and can no longer manage it. It lasted only a second, and then the wind took it. But I had heard it. I stood up. I listened. The draw was quiet except for the wind in the spruce tops and the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it again, faint, east. I left the elk where he was. I climbed out of the draw and headed east through the timber, breaking trail through 2 feet of new snow, and it took me the better part of 40 minutes before I came to the edge of the trees and saw the homestead below. I had known it was there. A widow's place. She had come out the spring before with 2 children and taken the land that had belonged to a man named Cutter, who had given up after 2 seasons and gone back east. I had seen her in town twice, in passing. I did not know her name. I knew the place had a good well and a solid roof, and that she had put up a garden and a small hay store, and that, looking at it now from the timber, the hay was long gone and the smoke coming from the chimney was thin and the color of it was wrong. Wrong smoke. You learn, spending years on a land like this, that smoke tells you things. The right smoke from a wood stove fed with dry split hardwood is a particular color and density. What was coming from that chimney was thinner, grayer, the color of smoke from green wood or wet wood, and my stomach went cold when I thought it, whatever was left. Whatever a person burns when the wood is gone and the cold is not. I stood at the edge of the timber and looked at the homestead for a long time. Then I went back to the elk. I worked fast. I did not have the time to do it the way I would have liked, but I had the skill to do it quickly without wasting, and I took what I could carry in a single load, and I left the rest gutted and snow-covered so it would keep, and I loaded up and started for the homestead. The walk down was hard going. No trail left, all of it drifted over, and I was carrying close to 60 pounds of meat wrapped in the elk's own hide, and the snow was thigh-deep in the draw and knee-deep in the open. By the time I came into the yard, my legs were burning and the sun had moved half across the sky. The yard was empty. The snow was unbroken all the way to the cabin door, which meant no one had been outside that morning, or had not had reason to go out and maybe not the strength for it. I knocked. Silence. I knocked again, harder, and said, "I am Standing Rock, from the Lakota people north of here. I have heard someone in distress. I am not going to leave until I know you are all right." A very long silence. Then the sound of something moving inside, slow, like a person who is being careful with every movement. Then the door opened. She was holding a rifle. I noticed that first, which tells you something about her, that starving, barely standing. She had thought to get the rifle before she opened the door. She was tall, or had been tall before whatever these past weeks had done to her. The bones of her face were too close to the surface. She was wearing everything she owned by the look of her, 2 coats, a blanket around her shoulders, and her eyes, when they focused on me, were the eyes of a person who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to keep the fright below the surface because the children are watching. She said, "What do you want?" Not a question, a challenge, even now. I said, "I was hunting in the draw east of here and I heard a sound. I have meat. I want to bring it inside." She looked at me. She looked at the bundle over my shoulder. She looked at me again. She lowered the rifle. She said, "My children are inside." I said, "I know. That is why I am standing here instead of walking away." She stepped back from the door. Inside was worse than I had prepared for. The two children were on the bed in the corner under every blanket in the house. A boy, maybe 8, and a girl who was younger, 5, maybe 6. They were awake. They watched me come through the door with the particular stillness of children who have learned in the past weeks that stillness conserves warmth and energy, and that most movement outside the routine is either nothing or something you should be frightened of. Their faces were thin. Not sick thin, not yet, but the particular thinness of people who have been going short for longer than they should have had to. The wood stove was barely going. She had been burning fence posts. I could see the grain of them in the remaining stack, rough, unsplit, old weathered lumber that would burn low and dirty, and give back a fraction of the heat that proper cordwood would. There were maybe 4 posts left. The last food in the cabin was a tin of something on the shelf. I could not tell what, and a half sack of cornmeal that was almost empty. I set the meat down on the table. I said, "How long?" She said, "Since the 12th of November. The last of the flour went then. I have been stretching the cornmeal." That was nearly 3 weeks. I looked at her, and she looked back at me with the flat, exhausted steadiness of a woman who has been managing a crisis alone for 3 weeks, and has stopped being able to afford any emotion that did not serve survival. I said, "I am going to need your stove." She said, "It barely holds heat." I said, "It will hold enough." I went to work. I am not going to walk you through every hour of it, but I want you to understand what those first hours were, because they matter. I built the fire up. I had brought some dry kindling in my pack. I always carry kindling in winter. And I got the stove producing real heat, and I started the meat going in the pot she had, the largest one. And while it cooked, I went back out to the wood pile and found what was there, and what wasn't, and I split what remained of the fence posts into pieces small enough to give a clean burn, and I stacked them by the door. Then I went back into the timber and broke dead branches for an hour, until I had enough for 2 days stacked against the south wall. By the time I came back and the cabin smelled different. It smelled like food, like heat, like a place where people were going to be all right. The boy was sitting up. He said, very careful, the way a child speaks when he has been told more than once not to be a nuisance. "Is there enough for her too?" He meant his mother. He was 8 years old, and he was asking if his mother was going to get to eat. I said, "There is enough for all 3 of you and then some, and tomorrow I am going back for the rest of the elk." He looked at me for a long time, then he lay back down. The woman was at the stove, stirring the pot, and she had her back to me and she did not turn around for a while. But I saw her shoulders. I saw what happened in them when the boy asked the question and when I answered it, like something that had been braced against a weight for 3 weeks, letting go a fraction. I did not say anything about it. I sat down and I waited for the meat to be ready. We ate late in the afternoon, all 4 of us at the table, not much, because you cannot put much into bodies that have been going empty. The stomach shrinks and protests, and you have to reintroduce food carefully, which I explained to her, and which she understood without having to be told twice. She was a practical woman. I could see it in the way she had managed these 3 weeks. The cornmeal stretched the way she had stretched it, the rationing of the fence posts, the keeping of the children in bed through the coldest hours, none of that happened by accident. She had done everything right. She had simply run out of things to do right with. The children ate, and went back to the warmth of the bed and were asleep in minutes. The genuine sleep, not the shallow, anxious sleep of the hungry. The sleep of people whose bodies know, finally, that the emergency is over. She sat across from me at the table, and she drank the broth from her cup, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I sent the boy to try to get to the Hendersons 3 weeks ago. He came back after 2 hours. He couldn't get through." I said, "The Henderson place is 4 miles. In this snow, with a child in that direction, no." She said, "I know, I shouldn't have sent him." I said, "You were trying everything you could." She said, "I should have tried harder before it got to that." I said, "You could not have known it would go on this long." She looked at me, she said, "I should have put up more. I knew the signs of a hard winter. I chose wrong on the hay, and I paid for it." I did not argue with her. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she was not asking me to tell her otherwise. She was a woman who took account of her own errors honestly. I respected that. I said, "You held out 3 weeks, with 2 children, on what you had." She said it was close. I said, "I know." She looked down at her cup. She said, "I heard you in the draw. I went to the door. I made a sound before I could stop it. I didn't think anyone would hear." I said, "Sound carries in the cold." She said, "I'm glad of that." She looked up at me then, straight, the way she had looked at me in the doorway with the rifle. Direct, no flinching, the look of a person who is going to see you clearly whether you like it or not. She said, "I don't know how to thank you. I have been trying to work out what to say for the last 3 hours and I haven't found it." I said, "You opened the door, that is enough." She said, "That is not enough, not even close to enough." I said, "It is what I needed. I heard a sound and I needed to know you were alive. Now I know, the rest is just work." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The rest is just work." She said it back to herself quietly, like she was writing it somewhere inside, like it was something worth keeping. I went back for the rest of the elk the next morning. The round trip was the better part of 8 hours in that snow. I broke the trail on the way out, and it was easier coming back with the load, staying in my own tracks. I had the meat in the cabin by mid-afternoon, and hung what would keep in the cold of the lean-to, and she put up the rest the way she knew to do it, and she knew to do it well. I should have gone home that evening. The weather was holding, and I could have made it back in 3 hours, and that would have been that. I had done what needed doing, and my own people had their own needs, and the proper thing was to go. I did not go. I told myself it was because the weather was uncertain. I told myself it was because the wood situation was not yet what it needed to be. I had gotten them through 2 days, but a proper supply was 2 weeks of work in those conditions, and I was not going to leave 2 children in a cabin that wasn't fully stocked. Both of those things were true. They were not the only reason. There was something in that cabin that I had not been inside in a long time. Not warmth in the physical sense, although there was that now, the stove going properly, the dry wood catching clean, the heat you can feel on your face from across the room. Something else. The particular aliveness of a place where people are present to each other. The boy asking his sister something across the room and her answering seriously, the way children do when they have been through something together, and come out the other side knowing they can count on each other. The woman moving between the stove and the table with a quiet efficiency that was different from the desperate management of 3 weeks ago, different because the immediacy was gone, and she could move without each motion being calculated against a dwindling margin. I sat in the corner and I watched all of it, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt in so long that it took me nearly a full hour to identify what it was. Belonging, not to my people, not to the office, not to the work, to a specific room at a specific hour because the people in the room were glad I was there. The child falling asleep in the chair by the stove and then rousing and looking around, verifying and finding me in the corner, and lying back down with the particular relaxation of a child who has confirmed that the thing keeping them safe is still in place. That look, that small look. I had been the fixed point for 19 years. I had not understood until that evening what it cost, not the fixing, the not being looked at, the not having a specific someone look across the room and settle because you are there. She looked up at me at one point from the stove and said simply, "Stay the night. The weather will be foul before morning." I said it may hold. She said it won't. I know this valley. Stay. I stayed. The weather did not hold. It came in hard before midnight, the wind picking up from the northwest, and by morning it was a proper blizzard and I was not going anywhere. That was the beginning of what I think of now as the 11 days. I did not plan for 11 days. No one plans for 11 days. The blizzard kept up for 3, and then a day of quiet that was misleading because the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 12 hours, and then another storm behind the first one. And by the time it had run through and the trails were passable again, 11 days had gone by, and I had lived inside that cabin for 11 days and everything had changed, though neither of us had said a word about anything changing. What do 11 days look like? They look like this. I was up before the others each morning, had the stove built up and the water on before she came out of the back room, and I want you to understand that this was not something we discussed or arranged. It is simply what I did because it was what needed doing, and because a stove that is cold in the morning is a stove that has failed to do its job, and I do not tolerate things failing to do their jobs if I am present and have the capacity to prevent it. They look like this. The boy's name was Thomas and he was 8, and he had his mother's directness without having fully learned yet when directness is useful and when it gets in your way. He asked me on the second day, while we were splitting wood together in the lean-to. I had determined he was old enough to learn to split and had handed him the hatchet and he was learning. He asked me, "Did you know my father?" I said, "No, I am sorry. What was he like?" He thought about this seriously, the way children think about questions they have not been asked before. He said, "He was not as strong as you, but he was funny. He knew a lot of jokes." I said, "That is not a small thing." He thought about that too. He said, "No, I guess it isn't." He went back to splitting. He was getting the hang of it. I did not say anything when he was getting it right because that is also something I believe, that a man doing a thing right does not need to be told he is doing a thing right. What he needs is to be given the harder piece next. I handed him the harder piece. He looked at it. He squared up and swung and got it on the second try. I said, "Good." He said, "You don't give many compliments." I said, "I just gave you one." He almost smiled. He was his mother's son. They look like this. Her name was Nora. I learned it on the third day when the blizzard was at its worst and we were inside all day, and there was nothing to do but talk and maintain the fire and play the card games the children knew. She told me about the farm she had grown up on in Ohio, which sounded nothing like this country, green and close, and small in the way that eastern land is small. And she had come west with her husband because he had the particular kind of hope that some men have about the West, which is partly fantasy and partly genuine possibility, and in his case had turned out to be enough of both to build something real before the fever took him in the second winter. She said, he was right about the land. He was right that there was something here. He just didn't get to stay for it. I said, that is a hard thing to live with, being right together and then being right alone. She said, yes, that is exactly it. She looked at me, she said, you have some of that too. I said, my wife died 11 years ago. She said, I know, you carry it differently than I carry mine, quieter. I said, I have had more time with it. She said, or you just hold things quieter. I did not answer that. She was right and we both knew she was right, and leaving it unsaid seemed like the correct thing. They look like this. The girl was Clara and she was 5 and she decided, somewhere in the first 2 days, that I was her particular domain. She did not ask my permission. She simply began appearing at my elbow at random intervals throughout the day and reporting things to me, observations mostly, things she had noticed that she felt required an audience. A spider she had found in the corner of the window. The way the snow on the sill had a particular shape. The fact that the cat, a gray animal of advanced age and decided opinions who had survived the 3 weeks on whatever the mice had not managed to retreat from, had chosen to sleep on my coat, which was folded by the stove. She said on the 3rd day, regarding the cat, "He likes you." I said, "He likes my coat." She said, "He doesn't like Thomas's coat, and Thomas's coat is warmer." I looked at her. She looked at me with the perfect seriousness of a 5-year-old making an irrefutable point. I said, "You may be right." She seemed satisfied by this. She went away. She came back an hour later and reported that the snow on the windowsill had changed shape, which she also felt I needed to know. Her mother, watching this from across the room, caught my eye once, and the expression on her face was something I have thought about many times since. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition, like she was watching her daughter do something that confirmed something she already suspected about me, and the confirmation pleased her. On the 5th day, with the second storm still running, I fixed the stove. I had been watching it since I arrived. The draw was wrong, had always been wrong. Whoever had installed the flue had set the angle too shallow, and it backed up in high wind and lost efficiency in calm, which is the worst of both situations. I did not say anything about it because it was not my stove to comment on and she had enough to deal with. But on the 5th day, with time on my hands, and the tools she had in the lean-to, I asked her if I could look at it. She said, "If you can make it stop doing what it does, you can do whatever you want to it." It took most of the afternoon. Thomas held things when I needed a second pair of hands. Clara observed. Nora kept the children out of the way and brought me coffee twice without being asked, setting it on the floor beside me without interrupting, which is the right way to bring a man coffee when he is working. When I had it right, I banked the fire and we waited. The stove came up to heat in half the time it had taken before. The heat stayed even instead of surging and dropping. The smoke went up clean. Thomas said, "It sounds different." I said, "It is different." He said, "Can you show me what you did?" So I showed him. He paid attention the way he had paid attention to the wood splitting, seriously, storing it. He said, "How do you know all this stuff?" I said, "I learned it, the same way you are learning it." He said, "Who taught you?" I said, "My father, and the men after my father, and 40 years of things going wrong and having to figure out why." He thought about that. He said, "I don't have a father anymore." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you think you could, when things go wrong here after you go, could I send word to you?" I sat there with that for a moment. An 8-year-old boy asking me if he could send word to me when things went wrong, not assuming, asking politely. Understanding that I was leaving and knowing he would need someone, and asking with the dignity of a child, who has learned that asking is better than not asking even when the answer might be no. I said, "You can always send word to me." He nodded. He went back to looking at the stove. From across the room she was not looking at us. But she had been still for too long, in the particular way of a person who is listening carefully and not letting on that they are. The storm broke on the 7th day and the cold broke a little on the 9th, and on the 11th morning I woke early and looked at the sky through the window, and I knew the trail north was open. I lay there for a while in the dark, in the stillness of a cabin where everyone else is asleep, and I listened to the breathing of the children and the quiet of the stove, and I thought about what I was going to go back to. The council, the agent, the fence lines, the work that was always there and that I was always the one to do it, and the particular quality of a life made entirely of that work, which is full in the sense that every hour is occupied and empty in the sense that you have stopped tracking whether anything in that occupation is for you. I lay there and I thought, I do not want to go back to that, not entirely, not the way it was. That was a new thought, or an old thought that had been waiting a long time for the right conditions to surface. I got up quietly and built the fire and put the water on, and I was sitting at the table with my coffee when she came out of the back room. She stopped when she saw my face. I do not know what my face was doing, but she read it immediately. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from me, and she did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "Today." I said, "The trail's clear." She said, "Yes, I thought so." Silence, the stove crackling, the light coming up gray through the window. She said, "Thomas is going to miss you." I said, "And Clara?" She said, "And Clara, yes." She held her cup, she looked at the table, then she said without looking up, "What about you? What are you going to miss?" It was a direct question. She was a direct woman. I had known this since she opened the door with a rifle in her hands. I said, "All of it." She looked up. I said, "I have been a chief for 19 years, and I have been the fixed point for 19 years, and I am good at it, and it is right that I do it, and I am not complaining about it. But somewhere in those years, I stopped being a man who was needed by a person, and started being a man who was needed by an office. And I did not know the difference until these 11 days. She held my gaze. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence. I said, "You have 2 children and a homestead and a stove that works now and enough wood for the rest of the winter. You do not need me to stay." She said, "No, I don't need you to stay." She set her cup down. She folded her hands on the table, her work-roughened hands, the hands of a woman who does not leave things undone. She said, "But I want you to come back." The light was coming through the window now, thin winter light, the particular gray gold of a plains morning after a long storm. It lay across the table between us. She said, "Not because we need rescuing. We will be all right. I know how to be all right. But because these 11 days were the first time in 2 years that I woke up in the morning, and the first thing I felt was not the weight of it all. And I think you know what I mean by that." I said, "I do." She said, "And because Clara has appointed you to some kind of permanent position that I don't think she is going to revoke." I said, "What position is that?" She said, "The person who is worth reporting things to. She doesn't give that to everyone." I looked at her, she was almost smiling, the real kind reaching her eyes. I said, "I will come back." She said, "Good, I'll tell her, she'll have a list of observations ready." I got up. I packed my things. She came to the door with me, and I stepped out into the cold, and the snow was hard and bright, and the trail north was clear the way I had known it would be. I turned back. She was standing in the doorway with her hands in her coat pockets, and she looked at me straight, the way she had always looked at me, without flinching, and she said, "Standing Rock." I said, "Yes." She said, "You came through that snow with 60 pounds of meat on your back because you heard one sound. One sound, and you turned around and came." I said, "It was the right thing to do." She said, "I know it was. I am not thanking you for the rightness of it. I am telling you that I will not forget it, that there is not a thing in this world you could ask of me that I would not do if it was in my power. You understand?" I stood there in the cold with the trail north laid out ahead of me, and I looked at her in the doorway and I said, "I understand." She said, "Come back in 2 weeks. Come for Sunday dinner. Bring your appetite. Thomas will want to show you something with the wood." I said, "I will be here." She nodded. She went inside, the door closed. I stood there another moment. Then I started north, breaking the fresh crust, the cold on my face and the light coming up over the eastern ridge, and the whole of the land spread out in the white silence around me. And I thought about what she had said, that there was not a thing I could ask of her that she would not do if it was in her power. A strong, self-sufficient, proud woman. A woman who had held out for 3 weeks on a dwindling margin and had kept her children alive and her dignity intact and had never once, until she could no longer avoid it, made a sound that might be heard, that woman saying, "I will not forget it. Come back." I thought about the boy's question, "Can I send word to you?" I thought about Clara and the spider, and the cat on my coat, and the shape of the snow on the sill. I thought about 11 days in a cabin where the first thing I did each morning was build up the fire, and the particular satisfaction of a stove that draws clean, and coffee set on the floor beside a man who is working, set there without a word, which is the right way to do it. I had been the fixed point for 19 years. The water moved around me, and I did not move, and that was the work, and it was right, and I was built for it. But I was also a man, and a man needs more than to be the point the water moves around. A man needs sometimes to walk into a room and have the people in it know that they are going to be all right because he is there. One room, one woman who opens the door to him, one boy who asks if he can send word. One small girl who decides, on no authority but her own, that he is the person worth reporting things to. I walked north in the snow and I thought, I will be back in 2 weeks. I thought, and after that. I thought, this is what it feels like when the thing you have been missing had a name all along, and you simply had not asked. It has been 2 years. I want to tell you where we are plainly. She runs the homestead. She runs it the way she runs everything, thoroughly, without waste, with a clear eye for what is working and what isn't and what needs to change. The south pasture that her husband broke is producing now in a way it wasn't in his time, because she figured out the drainage issue in the second spring and fixed it herself before I even knew there was a problem. She put up enough last fall to carry through 2 hard winters without help. She does not need rescuing. She has never needed rescuing, not really, not in any permanent way. She needed one man to hear one sound in the cold and turn around. I come every 2 weeks when the weather permits and more often when it doesn't. There is a room in the main house at the homestead, the east room, the one with the good window where my things are. Not all of my things. I am still the chief. I am still at the main house on the reservation through most of the week. The council needs what it needs, and the land needs what it needs. But on Sundays I am here, and some days besides, and when the seasons turn and the work is heaviest I am here more than I am home, and my people know where to find me and nobody has objected in any serious way, which I think is because things that work tend to quiet argument eventually. Thomas is 10. He can split anything I hand him, and he has started teaching himself to read track, which I did not tell him to do. He simply began doing it, because he is paying attention to the land and the land rewards attention. I am teaching him the elk runs. He will know this country the way I know it, which means he will be able to live in it the way I can, which means he will not have another November like the one his mother had, because he will know what is coming before it comes. Clara is 7. And her list of things worth reporting has not gotten shorter. She informed me last week that the gray cat has begun sleeping on Thomas's coat, which she considered a significant defection, and which she described to me in full detail for a considerable length of time. I listened to all of it seriously, because I have learned that listening to Clara seriously is both the right thing to do and the thing she requires in order to move on to the next observation. Her mother was watching from across the room. The look on her face was the same one it was that first week: recognition, satisfaction, the look of a woman who has seen something confirmed. I looked back at her. She held my gaze for a moment, then went back to what she was doing. That is how it is between us most of the time. Plain, steady, not the kind of thing that needs a great deal of announcement. She said she would not forget. She has not forgotten. I said I would come back. I have come back. What is between us is built from those 2 facts and everything they have generated in 2 years of Sundays and woodpiles and dinners and long winter evenings by a stove that draws clean. There is something I want to say about the elk, about that morning. I want to say it plain because a man should be honest about the things that have changed him. I had spent 19 years being the man who heard everything and went to sea, being the man who turned around, being the man who did not put his own rest above someone else's need. I thought I knew what that was. I thought I was simply doing the work a chief does, which is to respond always to what needs responding to. But that morning in the draw I heard one sound, not a cry, not a call for help, just a sound, involuntary, barely audible, from a direction where I had not expected a person to be, and I left the elk where he was and I went to look. Not because I was certain anyone needed help, because there was a chance someone did, and the chance was enough. And she opened the door with a rifle in her hands, starving, exhausted, her children in the corner, and she stepped back to let me in. She let me in. I have been thinking about those 3 words for 2 years. She had not let anyone in, not really, not since her husband died and the weight had settled on her alone, and she had learned to carry it alone because there was no one else. She had held out for 3 weeks on nothing, managing, rationing, keeping the fear below the surface because the children were watching. And she heard my voice on the other side of the door, and she lowered the rifle and she stepped back. I had done many things in 58 years. I had led my people through grief and negotiation, and the kind of slow attrition that does not make stories but takes everything. I had buried my wife and my children, and I had done the work of mourning after mourning when mourning was the hardest part. I had been the fixed point. But I had not been let in by someone who had every reason not to let anyone in, who had been tested to the edge of what a person can hold, who looked at me through a half-open door and decided, in the space of a breath, that I was worth the risk of the door opening. That is a thing that does not leave you. It is November again. The first hard cold is down from the north and the elk are moving in the draw, and this year I am not hunting alone. Thomas is beside me, which means I am talking less and watching more, because a boy learning to hunt is a boy learning to be still, and that requires a man beside him who is also still. The homestead is stocked. I made sure of it in September. 3 weeks ago I spent 4 days cutting and stacking wood on that property until she told me plainly that if I cut one more cord she was going to make me stack it in the house. I said, "Nora," she said, "there is enough." I stopped cutting. There is enough. She says it the way she says most things, plain, conclusive, not a comfort but a fact. There is enough and we are ready, and when the snow comes we will be inside it together instead of on opposite sides of it. I thought about that this morning before the light came, lying in the east room with the window dark and the cold quiet outside, listening to the house breathe. The particular sound of a house where people are sleeping. Thomas in his room, growing again by the sound of him, all elbows and length. Clara in hers, the cat with her probably, having defected back from Thomas's coat sometime in October. Nora in the next room, her breathing even, the breathing of a woman who sleeps without one ear open anymore, which is a thing she has told me she had not done in 2 years. Not until this year. Not until she knew there was someone else awake to catch what might need catching. I am not sure I have always been easy to be near. I have been told I am not, by people I respect enough to believe. I hold things in. I move through the world expecting it to get out of my way, or I did, or I am learning not to. I do not find it natural to say what I feel in the moment I feel it. I find it natural to let the action carry the meaning and trust that a person paying attention will read it. And she pays attention, so this has mostly served us. But I said one thing to her last winter that I want to tell you. It was February, cold, the kind of February that just holds and holds. We were alone in the evening after the children were in bed, and she was reading something and I was at the table and there was nothing that needed saying, and I said it anyway. I said, "You are the reason I stopped being tired." She looked up from her book. I said, "I do not mean the children, I mean you, the way you are, the way you have been every day, the way you opened the door." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You heard me, in that draw. I made one sound and you heard it and you came." She said, "I was not going to send for help. I had decided that if the cornmeal ran out before the storm broke, I was going to walk the children to the Henderson place no matter the snow. I was not going to let someone find us. I was going to go. She said, and then you came through the door with 60 pounds of elk on your shoulder and you said, I have meat. And I thought, so this is what it looks like when someone comes. She looked at her book. She said quietly, I had forgotten what that looked like. I did not say anything. After a while she went back to reading and I sat at the table and looked at the lamp and I thought about what she had just given me. Not thanks, not gratitude. Something more than that. The telling of a thing she had not told anyone, maybe had not even told herself in those exact words, the shape of the moment from her side of it. So I would know. So I would understand what it had been for her. Here is the door. Here is what it cost me to open it. Here is what it meant that you were on the other side. I am the fixed point. I have been the fixed point for 19 years and I will be for whatever years remain to me, because that is what this work is and I was built for it, and I do not want it otherwise. But I am also the man who heard one sound in a cold draw and turned around. And she is the woman who, when I knocked, lowered the rifle and opened the door. That is everything. That is what everything else is built on. The snow is starting. I can see it through the east window, the first light flakes coming in on the north wind. By morning the draw will be white again, and the elk will be moving and Thomas and I will be out in the timber before the light is full. And tonight Nora is in the next room. And there is enough. There has always been enough when you know what the enough is. It took me 58 years and one sound in the cold to learn that, but I learned it. That is the story, that is all of it. Go well.